25 is where we will pick up right now. Now, the cost of conformity. You see, when Christian communities fully live into their nonconformist calling, when the kingdom of God and not social norms shapes their ethic, the world gets put on notice. They become prophetic witnesses to the gospel. Now, this was no clearer than early Christian communities who were the persecuted minority group and yet had a powerful voice in culture. Consider this letter written by a 2nd century Roman political to the Emperor Hadrian, who was warning him of this strange fringe Christian movement. And the quote is right there in your journal on page 25, and it reads, quote, "They love one another. They never fail to help widows. They save orphans from those who would hurt them. If they have something, they give freely to the man who has nothing. If they see a stranger, they take him in home and are happy as though he were a real brother. They don't consider themselves brothers in the usual sense, but brothers instead through the Spirit in God." That was from a book by Jim Wallace called Call to Conversion on page 15. You see, sometimes when we think about it, something has been lost along the way throughout the Christian history. You see, the early church had a moral voice that spoke out to the dominant culture. It was a voice of conviction and not of blind conformity. But it seems that gradually the church has lost her essence, her voice, and her sense of mission to the world. She's become captive to cultural values and not kingdom values, shaped by society instead of shaping society. You see, Dr. King has a great analogy for this. He says, the church is now a thermometer and not a thermostat. A thermometer merely tells you the temperature of the room, while a thermostat changes the room's climate. And I wonder today, as we think about the church, the American church, would you agree with King's assessment? And also, how have you seen cultural values shape Christianity and the church? Why don't you pause this video and in the discussion box in your upper right-hand corner, answer those questions. All right, welcome back. Now I want to talk about inner transformation. Inner transformation. You see, it's important to understand that King does not feel nonconformity per se is good. He sees nonconformity at its root as a spiritual battle, and therefore needing to come from a place of deep humility and love for others. You see, this isn't possible. This nonconformity, it's not possible without inner transformation through the grace of God. And we must always make ourselves available to God's grace through commitment and fidelity to prayer and self-reflection. And so I ask you, what's the danger of being a non-transformed nonconformist? What are examples of a non-transformed nonconformist? And what spiritual disciplines might be important for inner transformation? I want you to think about those 3 questions, because at the end of this module, we're going to have a short quiz for you to take that'll ask you those 3 questions. And then let me conclude just talking about one of the influences of Dr. King's life, or in Dr. King's life, and it was the Christian mystic Howard Thurman. You see, as we look at King's life more closely, it's important to note that some of the people that influenced his thinking. We oftentimes hear about Gandhi, but Howard Thurman, one of the most influential African Americans in the 20th century, significantly impacted King's life. Howard Thurman was an author, a theologian, a civil rights leader, and King's spiritual advisor. They originally met at Boston University, where Thurman was a professor. And throughout the years, Thurman developed King's thoughts on spiritual disciplines and introduced him to the nonviolent philosophy of Gandhi. So during the Montgomery bus boycott, King carried Thurman's book, Jesus and the Disinherited. And this book discusses Jesus' teaching that unconditional love would help the oppressed endure suffering. You see, in it, Thurman writes that the first order of social change is a changing internal spirit. So as we conclude this lesson for this module, I want you to reflect on what it means, again, to find that strength to love. Where does it come from? How do disciplines help us to develop an inner strength in order to create social change in the world? For your homework and your reading for this coming week, I want you to read chapter 2 of Strength to Love. And then I want you to think about this reflection question for the week. Where in our culture do you feel drawn to practice nonconformity? And what would it look like for you to do this? What feelings, such as concerns, fears, or hopes, does this bring up for you? Reflect on that question this week and make sure you write it down in your journal as you're going through your weekly rhythms of prayer and reading and meditation and rest. And as you're doing that, get prepared for the following week's module. Again, my name is Peter Watts Jr. I'm the LA City Director with Rewire, and it is great to have you here virtually for our class, Character of a Change Agent, Finding the Strength to Love. See you next week.